Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. Page 361. A hard November wind is spattering goopy sleet against the broad windows all around the hall. The Provident Nursing Home cafeteria is lit by a checkerboard array of oversized institutional bulbs overhead, a few of which are always low and give off fluttery strobes. The fluttering bulbs are why Pat Montesian and all the other photo-seizure-prone area AAs never go to White Flag, opting for the freeway group over in Brookline or the candy-ass Lake Street meeting up in West Newton on Sunday nights, which Pat M. bizarrely drives all the way up from her home down on the South Shore in Milton to get to hear people talk about their analysts and sobs. There is no way to account for people's taste in AA. The White Flag Hall is so brightly lit up, all Gately can see out any of the windows is a kind of shiny, drooling black against everyone's pale reflection. Miracles, one of the Boston AA terms Erdedi and the brand new and very shaky veiled girl resident standing over him complain they find hard to stomach. As in, we're all miracles here, and don't leave 5 minutes before the miracle happens, and to stay sober for 24 hours is a miracle. Except the brand new girl, either Joelle V. or Joelle D., who said she'd hit the occasional meeting in the past before her bottom, and had been roundly repelled, and is still pretty much cynical and repelled, said, on the way down to Provident under Gately's direct new resident supervision, says she finds even the word miracle preferable to the constant AA talk about the grace of God, which reminds her of wherever she grew up, where she's indicated places of worship were often aluminum trailers or fiberboard shacks, and churchgoers played with copperheads in the services to honor something about serpents and tongues. Gately's also observed how Erdedi's also got that Tufts Harvard way of speaking, without seeming to move his lower jaw. It's as if it's its own country or something, Erdedi complains, legs crossed and maybe a bit of a faggy schoolboy way, looking around at the raffle break, sitting in Gately's generous shadow. The first time I ever talked over at the St. E's meeting on Wednesday, somebody comes up after the Lord's Prayer and says, good to hear you. I could really ID with that bottom you were sharing about, the isolating, the can't and can't. It's the greenest I've ever felt in months hearing you. And then gives me this raffle ticket with his phone number that I didn't ask for and says I'm right where I'm supposed to be, which I have to say I found a bit patronizing. The best noise Gately produces is his laugh, which booms and reassures, and a certain haunted hardness goes out of his face when he laughs. Like most huge men, Gately has kind of a high, hoarse-speaking voice. His larynx sounds compressed. I still hate that right where you're supposed to be thing, he says, laughing. He likes that Erdedi, sitting, looks right up at him and cocks his head slightly, to let Gately know he's got his full attention. Gately doesn't know that this is a requisite for a white-collar job, where you have to show you're attending fully to clients who are paying major sums and get to expect an overt display of full attention. Gately is still not yet a good judge of anything about upscale people, except where they tend to hide their valuables. Boston AA, with its emphasis on the group, is intensely social. The raffle break goes on and on. An intoxicated street guy with a venulated nose and missing incisors and electrician's tape wrapped around his shoes is trying to sing Volare up at the empty podium microphone. He is gently, cheerfully induced off stage by a crocodile with a sandwich and an arm around his shoulders. There's a certain pathos to the crocodile's kindness, his clean flannel arm around the weather-stained shoulders, which pathos Gately feels and likes being able to feel. While he says, but at least the good to hear you, I quit minding. It's just what they say when somebody's got done speaking. They can't say like good job or you spoke well, Because it can't be anybody's place here to judge if anybody else did good or bad or whatnot. You know what I'm saying? Tiny there? Tiny Yule, in a blue suit and laser chronometer, and tiny shoes, whose shine you could read by, is sharing a dirty aluminum ashtray with Nell Gunther, who has a glass eye, which she amuses herself by usually wearing so the pupil and iris face in, and the dead white and tiny manufacturer specifications on the back of the eye face out. Both of them are pretending to study the blonde false wood of the tabletop, and Ewell makes a bit of a hostile show of not looking up or responding to Gately or entering into the conversation in any way, which is his choice and on him alone, so Gately lets it go. Wade McDade has a Walkman going, which is technically okay at the raffle break, although it's not a real good idea. Chandler Foss is flossing his teeth and pretending to throw the used floss at Jennifer Belbin. Most of the Ennett House residents are mingling satisfactorily. The couple of residents that are black are mingling with other blacks. The Deal Kid and Dooney Glynn are amusing themselves, telling homosexuality jokes to Morris Hanley, who sits, smoothing his hair with his fingertips, pretending to not even acknowledge his left hand still bandaged. Alfonso Barayes Carbo is standing with 3 Alston Group guys, smiling broadly and nodding, not understanding a word anybody says. Bruce Green has gone downstairs to the men's head and amused Gately by asking his permission first. Gately told him to go knock himself out. Green has good big arms and no gut, even after all the substances, and Gately suspects he might have played some ball at some point. Kate Gombert is totally by herself at a non-smoking table over by a window, ignoring her pale reflection and making little cardboard tents out of her raffle tickets and moving them around. Clennette Henderson clutches another black girl and laughs and says, "Girl!" several times. Emil Minty is clutching his head. Jeff Day, in his black turtleneck and blazer, keeps lurking on the fringes of various groups of people, pretending he's part of the conversations. No immediate sign of Bert F. Smith or Charlotte Treat. Randy Lenz, in his cognito white mustache and sideburns, is doubtless at the payphone in the northeast corner of the Provident lobby downstairs. Lenz spends nearly unacceptable amounts of time either on a phone or trying to get in a position to use a phone. 'Cause what I like. Gately says to Erdady really is listening, even though there's a compellingly cheap young woman in a brief white skirt and absurd black mesh stockings, sitting with her legs nicely crossed. One strapped low-spiked black Ferragamos, too. At the periphery of his vision, and the woman is with a large man, which makes her look even more compelling. And also, the veiled new girl's breasts and her hips' clefts are compelling and distracting next to him, even in a long, baggy, loose blue sweater that matches the embroidered selvage around her veil. What I think I like is how "it was good to hear you" ends up like saying 2 separate things together. Gately's also saying this to Joelle, who, it's weird, but you can tell she's looking at you, even through the linen veil. There's maybe 6 or so veiled people in the White Flag Hole today. A decent percentage of people in the 11-step union of the hideously and improbably deformed are also in 12-step fellowships for other issues, besides hideous deformity. Most of the room's veiled AAs are women, though there is one male-veiled UHID guy that's an active white flagger. Tommy S. or F., who years ago nodded out on a stuffed acrylic couch with a bottle of Remy and a lit Tipperillo. The guy now wears UHID veils and a whole spectrum of silk turtlenecks and assorted hats and classy lambskin driving gloves. Gately's had the UHID and veil philosophy explained to him in passing a couple of times, but still doesn't much get it. It seems like a gesture of shame and concealment, still, to him, the veil. Pat Montesian had said that there's been a few other UHIDs who'd gone through Annett House prior to the year of dairy products from the American heartland, which is when new resident Gately came wobbling in. But this Joelle Van Dyne, who Gately feels he has zero handle on yet as a person, or how serious she is about putting down substances and coming in to get really straight, this Joelle is the first veiled resident Gately's had under him as a staffer. This Joelle girl that wasn't even on the 2-month waiting list for intake got in overnight under some private arrangement with somebody on the house's board of directors. Upscale Enfield guys into charity and directing. There'd been no intake interview with Pat at the house. The girl just showed up 2 days ago, right after supper. She'd been up at Brigham and Women's for 5 days after some sort of horrific OD-type situation, said to have included both D-fib paddles and priests. She'd had real luggage and this, Chinese portable dressing screen thing with clouds and pop-eyed dragons that even folded lengthwise took both Green and Pariah's carbo to lug upstairs. There's been no talk of a humility job for her, and Pat's counseling the girl personally. Pat's got some sort of privately directed arrangement with the girl. Gately's already seen enough private-type arrangements between certain staffers and residents to feel like it's maybe kind of a character defect of Ennet House. A girl from the Brookline Young People's Group over in a cheerleader skirt and slut stockings is ignoring all the ashtrays and putting her extra-long gasper out on the bare tabletop 2 rows over as she laughs at something an acne guy in a long camel hair coat he hasn't taken off and sockless leather dance shoes Gately's never seen at a meeting before says. And he's got his hand on hers as she grinds the gasper out. Something like putting a cigarette out against the wood-grain plastic tabletop, which Gately can already see, the ragged black burn divot that's formed. It's something the rankness of which would never have struck him one way or the other before, until Gately took on half the break down the hole and wipe down the tables jobs at ferocious Francis G's suggestion. And now he feels sort of proprietary about the Providence tabletops. But it's not like he can go over and take anybody else's inventory and tell them how to behave. He settles for imagining the girl pinwheeling through the air, through a glass wall. When they say it sort of means like what you said was good for them, it helped them out, somehow, he says. But plus now also, I like saying it myself because if you think about it, it also means that it was good to be able to hear you, to really hear. He's trying subtly to alternate and look at Erdedi and Joelle both, like he's addressing them both. It's not something he's good at. His head's too big to be subtle with. Because I remember for the first 60 days or so, I couldn't hear shit. I didn't hear nothing. I'd just sit there and compare. I'd go to myself I never rolled a car. I never lost a wife. I never bled from the rectum. Jean would tell me to just keep coming for a while, and sooner or later I'd be able to both listen and hear. He said it's hard to really hear, but he wouldn't say what was the difference between hearing and listening, which pissed me off. But after a while, I started to really hear. It turns out, and this is just for me, maybe, but it turned out hearing the speaker means all of a sudden, hearing how fucking similar the way he felt and the way I felt were out there at the bottom before we each came in, instead of just sitting here resenting being here and thinking how he bled from the ass and I didn't, and how that means I'm not as bad as him yet and I can still be out there. One of the tricks to being of real service to newcomers is not to lecture or give advice, but only talk about your own personal experience. and what you were told and what you found out personally, and to do it in a casual but positive and encouraging way. Plus, you're supposed to try and identify with the newcomer's feelings as much as possible. Ferocious Francis G. says this is one of the ways guys with just a year or two sober can be most helpful. Being able to sincerely ID with the newly sick and suffering. Ferocious Francis told Gately as they were wiping down tables that if a crocodile, with decades of sober AA time, can still sincerely empathize and identify with a whacked-out, bug-eyed, disease-ridden newcomer, then there's something deeply fucked about that crocodile's recovery. The crocodiles, decades sober, live in a totally different spiritual galaxy, inside. One long-timer describes it as he has seen a whole new, unique interior spiritual castle, now, to live in. Part of this new Joelle girl's pull for Ken or Drady isn't just the sexual thing of her body, which he finds made way sexier by the way the overlarge blue coffee-stained sweater tries to downplay the body thing without being so hubristic as to try to hide it. Sloppy sexiness pulls her daddy in like a well-groomed moth to a lit window. But it's also the veil, wondering what horrific contrast to the body's allure lies swollen or askew under that veil. It gives the pull a perverse sideways slant that makes it even more distracting. And so, Erdedi cocks his head a little more up at Gately and narrows his eyes to make his listening look terribly intense. He doesn't know that there's an abstract distance in the look that makes it seem like he's studying a real bitch of a 7-iron on the 10th rough or something. The look doesn't communicate what he thinks his audience wants it to. The raffle break is winding down as everybody starts to want their own ashtray. 2 more big urns of coffee emerge from the kitchen door over by the literature table. Erdedi is probably the second biggest leg and foot joggler in present residence. After Jeffrey D. Joel versus D, now says something very strange. It's a very strange little moment, right at the end of the raffle break, and Gately later finds it impossible to describe it in his log entry for the PM shift. It's the first time he realizes that Joelle's voice, crisp and rich and oddly empty, her accent just barely southern, and with a strange and it turns out Kentuckian lapse in the pronunciation of all apicals except S, is familiar in a faraway way that both makes it familiar and yet lets Gately be sure he's never once met her before, out there. She inclines the plane of her blue-bordered veil briefly towards the floor's tile. Very bad tile, scab-colored, nauseous, worst thing about the big room by far. Brings it back up level. Unlike her daddy, she's standing, and in flats, is nearly Gately's height, and says that she finds it especially hard to take when these earnest, ravaged folks at the lectern say they're here but for the grace of God. Except that's not the strange thing, she says, because when Gately nods hard and starts to interject about it was the same for, and wants to launch into a fairly standard Boston AA agnostic soothing riff about the God and the slogan being just shorthand for a totally subjective and up-to-you higher power, and AA being merely spiritual instead of dogmatically religious, a sort of benign anarchy of subjective spirit. Joelle cuts off this interjection and says that her trouble with it is but for the grace of God is a subjunctive, a counterfactual, she says, and can make sense only when introducing a conditional clause, like, e.g., but for the grace of God, I would have died on Molly Notkin's bathroom floor. So that an indicative transposition, like, I'm here but for the grace of God, is, she says, literally senseless, and regardless of whether she hears it or not, it's meaningless. and that the foamy enthusiasm with which these folks can say what in fact means nothing at all makes her want to put her head in a radder range at the thought that substances have brought her to the sort of pass where this is the sort of language she has to have blind faith in. Gately looks at a rectangular blue selvage expanse of clean linen, whose gentle rises barely allude to any features below. He looks at her and has no idea whether she's serious or not, or whacked, or trying like Dr. Jeff Day to erect denial-type fortifications with some kind of intellectuous showing off. And he doesn't know what to say in reply. He has absolutely nothing in his huge square head to identify with her with, or latch onto, or say in encouraging reply. And for an instant, the Provident cafeteria seems pin-drop silent. And his own heart grips him like an infant, rattling the bars of its playpen. And he feels a greasy wave of an old and almost unfamiliar panic. And for a second, it seems inevitable that at some point in his life he's going to get high again and be back in the cage all over again, because for a second, the blank white veil leveled at him seems a screen on which might well be projected a casual and impressive black and yellow smiley face, grinning, and he feels all the muscles in his own face loosen and descend kneeward. And the moment hangs there, distended, until the White Flag raffle coordinator for November, Glenn Kay, glides up to the podium mic in his scarlet velour caparison and makeup and candelabrum with candles the same color as the floor tile, and uses the plastic gavel to formally end the break and bring things back to whatever passes here for order, for the raffle drawing. The Watertown guy with middle-level sober time who wins the big book publicly offers it to any newcomer that wants it. And Gately is pleased to see Bruce Green raise a big hand and decides he'll just turn it over and ask ferocious Francis G. for feedback on subjunctives and countersexuals. And the infant leaves its playpen alone inside him. And the rivets of the long table, his seat's attached to, make a brief, distressed noise as he sits and settles in for the second half of the meeting, asking silently for help to be determined to try to really hear or die trying. NNYC's harbors Liberty Island's gigantic lady has the sun for a crown and holds what looks like a huge photo album under one iron arm, and the other arm holds aloft a product. The product is changed each 1st of January by brave men with pythons and cranes.